Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Hamburg, Germany. My name is Sarah Bazubandi. I'm a Marie Curie Fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, and also have the honor of being a non-resident fellow at ISPI. This event is the second that we have organized this year in partnership with MENA-OECD Governance Program, and is a part of a year-long initiative which would lead us to the 9th edition of the Rome Med Dialogue. This is the annual conference on the wider Mediterranean region that is organized by as a joint effort by ISPI and Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. And this year conference, if you'd like to mark your calendars, will be held from the 2nd to the 4th of November. The quest for advancing democracy, expanding economic participations, and furthering social justice has remained unfruitful in many parts of the world, and specifically in the Middle East, North Africa region. This is the case. In this region, a combination of factors such as ideological polarization, economic low points, in some cases over-dependence on natural resource incomes, has created a challenging environment in which an erosion of quality of governance have become evident. Shortcomings in resource efficiency and absence of consensus building mechanisms are amongst the key factors that have created this environment. At the same time, some significant improvements have also been made and become visible, specifically in the international and regional cooperation. The establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and some of the Arab nations, re-establishment of diplomatic relations and diplomatic ties between Iran and the GCC are to be mentioned in this context. Today, I have the pleasure of chairing this discussion, and we have three very distinguished speakers coming from different parts of life with us to unpack some of these regional complexities. I'm going to introduce them one by one as we go through the discussion. I'm going to invite them one by one to make their contributions to this discussion. And of course, we will be opening the floor to Q&A. So feel free to post your questions throughout the discussion in the question Q&A option of Zoom. Our first speaker is MIRIAM ALLAM. She is the head of MENA-OECD Governance Program. Welcome, MIRIAM. It's a pleasure to have you today. I'd like to start inviting you to the conversation. You know, as you have wealth of experience in this region, you know that the MENA region faces today very important challenges. Some of them are common at the global level. Some of them are more acute and more challenging at the regional level. Climate change, the global pandemic, economic challenges, the list can go on. How do you see these challenges playing a role in affecting the governance structure in the MENA region? How could they affect the so-called good governance practices, and what are the priorities for reform to change some of the existing mechanisms to build strong and resilient governments and administrations that can address the future challenges and the existing challenges in a better, more efficient manner? The floor is yours, Maria.
Thank you, Sarah. And let me also extend my thanks to ISPI for the kind invitation and the excellent cooperation. We really enjoy working with you on the MED dialogues. And I would also like to thank Italy for its leadership in the MENA-OECD governance program. Italy is currently sharing the initiative and is also hosting our training center in Caserta. Well, I'm really happy that this webinar is looking at public governance. It's so important, as it is indeed making the difference between policies that fly and policies that flop, as one of my colleagues always says. With regards to your question on the challenges, for sure, their scale and also their scope vary across the region, and we should always keep that in mind. Yet a series of common challenges can be observed and has also profound impact on how government are operating. And I would even say that they have also tested government's ability to deliver, be it the COVID crisis or the energy crisis, food security. I would like to remind you that food inflation are standing at 30% in the region as of last year. The climate change that you have mentioned and its consequences for water shortage. Again, I would like to remind that the region is home to 10 out of 18 of the most water-stressed countries in the world. The demographic developments, which is putting pressure on the education system in the labor market, and the number of severe conflicts that have profound and devastating consequences. And when we look at governance indicators over time, you will see that the MENA region is one of the few regions in the world that has lost ground in terms of good governance, be it on indicators related to control of corruption, regulatory quality, rule of law, which are core elements for government to deliver effectively. Again, we see some countries are doing better, while others are negative outliers. But I think what is extremely important is that with this comes also a general overall decline of trust, with only 37% of citizens in the region trusting their government in 2021. And as we always say, without trust, there will be no reform, no policy sustainable enough to build the future that our citizens want. So we are standing today at a critical juncture, or to speak with the title of the webinar, at a long and for sure winding road that demands the modernization of governance framework and practices. At the OECD, we are currently working on a report which is based on OECD recommendations in the field of public governance, a collective body of legal instruments on public governance that our member countries have agreed upon, be it on open government recommendation, public procurement, budgeting, digital governance, you name it. And I would say there are four key areas of reform objectives for governments to address today's most pressing challenges. And the first one I would like to highlight is that governance arrangement and tools to deliver on long-term objective has become extremely important. And this requires not only the steering at the center of government, but also the strategic planning and coordination to lead the whole of government action and to break the well-known administrative silos. You have seen multi-annual visions mushrooming in the region that integrate SDGs to support implementation of these long-term goals. I would like to cite Jordan 2025, as we have a colleague from Jordan with us, or Egypt Vision 2030, Saudi Vision 2030, UAE Centennial, or recently Morocco adopted the new development model 2035. To implement these visions, it's extremely important to have these planning and coordination arrangement and capacities that will be pivotal, as is also access to quality data and ensuring the mobilization of stakeholders as key drivers to foster evidence-based policy making, what we call in the OECD, but also to monitor progress over time. The second part is public spending, that public spending is done more efficiently according to the resources available. Budgetary governance framework will be important, moving away from the standard line item approach to a more policy-based budgeting that is also helping you to facilitate strategic allocations of financial resources and will increase budget transparency. Or public procurements, and not to forget that almost 20% of the GDP in MENA accounts for public procurement. Using this more strategically, using this also in a more transparent manner to create opportunities for all will be important. The third one is delivering effectively, and here the importance of having a civil service that is fit for purpose and creating a business environment that is there to strive for citizens and businesses alike by reducing regulatory burdens and implementing a better regulation agenda and applying also user-centric digital delivery models. And that's my last point now, because we are running out of time, and I would like also to make a bridge to my next colleague, which is the fourth aspect, which is promoting open and inclusive society, not only the importance of fighting corruption, but also really to opening new ways to interact with citizens, giving them a voice in the policymaking process. We have seen really interesting initiatives in Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, that I have joined the Open Government Partnership, and I'm really eager also to hear from the civil societies how these commitments are or are not used in their day-to-day business. And with this, I would like to hand over the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You really touched upon a lot of points. And at the heart of this sits the question of lack of trust and lack of accountability, trust on the people's side and accountability on the government side. Your comments about creating and promoting your last point, I think, really nicely connects us to our next point in the discussion. That is one of the responsibilities of the government is to create and maintain a space that can be open to civil society and to implementation of more inclusive policies. That brings us to our next panelist today, AMER, BANI AMER. He's the Director General of Al-Hayat Center. Welcome, AMER. Thank you for being here today with us. As Miriam mentioned, civil society has a very clear role in strengthening the public governance and creating and contributing in this constant dialogue between the citizens and the state, between the citizens and the government, holding the government accountable, promoting transparency, work efficiently along the government to be able to create an environment that the more marginalized segments of the society can be reached to. So in your opinion, Amer, how could civil society organizations work effectively with the governments to keep the governments more accountable and create mechanisms for inclusion? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for ISPI team for having us this afternoon. And this is my second participation with ISPI, and this is like a very important role in enhancing dialogue in the MENA region. And also thank you for my colleagues in OECD for this partnership. Like talking about the role of civil society, seriously, we all know that advocacy and lobbying with the government is very important to keep the government accountable and to enhance the accountability. But let's think from the angle of civil society, how civil society can do this job. Civil society can do this job by different ways. First, civil society should believe in collaboration, what I call it in our local language, positive engagement. Sometimes we find many of the civil society organizations, they like to their technique or methodology to stay with the other side of the institutions, especially the government or like semi-government institutions. I think believing, not only doing the collaboration, believing on the collaboration with the government is essential to make this change inside the government and to enhance the role of civil society and to sustain the role of civil society, not only just to do an activity, also to sustain it. To do this collaboration, also civil society should be professional in doing very professional work. Like what we are doing in our work, for example, we have a program of government monitoring. Government monitoring, we are monitoring all the government commitments, and we are issuing a report every 6 months about government monitoring. So it's kind of collaboration, keeping the government accountable. But to do that, we have a very high qualified team who's following all the government commitments, make sure that this information that flow to the media after we publish it to the media, it's professional, it's true, it's making the difference, and it's not easy to be challenged. At the same time, when you do this, the government, they start change. They start responding to our reports. At the beginning, they don't accept it. Then they start respond partially. Then they start sending responding to us that, okay, you said this, this is no, we did this, we don't do this. So this collaboration is essential, but you should do your job very professionally, very professional. Also, you should keep trying. In our region, in MENA region, we are all know what's going on. So, but if you do it the first time, they refuse, they should try another time, another time. Keep trying. This is like what I'm saying to my colleagues. We should keep trying. This is MENA region. This is the local context. We should understand the local context. Yani, if you send this time the letter to the minister, he did not respond, try to visit him, try to call one staff, try to communicate, because this is the MENA region. This is like today in the MENA region, the whole atmosphere is to squeeze the space for civil society in Jordan, in Tunis, in Egypt, everywhere. It's kind of a trend in the whole MENA region. So we should like understand the context and try to change our techniques, to be patient and try to keep this dialogue, because we don't have choices. That's the limited space we have, and we should work with this limited space. Another point that can enhance the capacity of civil society to do this work with the government is to make what I call it public awareness about the importance about what our work. So we enhance the legitimacy of our work. We enhance the supporters for our work. And to do this, you should be visible. Yani many of our colleagues, they try to hide sometimes from visibility. Like they said, let's keep low profile. It's easy. We don't want to open the eyes. But if you become visible, especially, and you build a strong relation with media, this will give you legitimacy. This will enhance your role. This will raise your reports, your intervention to the government and to other institutions, and it become more stronger. So within all of this context, your organization can do the advocacy and can do the lobbying with the government, and can do a serious impact in this field. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your input. You rightly pointed out two very relevant points that, in my understanding, creates an environment which is often not easy to deal with. On the one hand, you have space being constantly tightened and squeezed on the civil society. We have, in some parts of the region, we have very vague definitions of national security. Anybody that is active in any form of civil society activities could easily, at any given point in time, be accused of acting against the national security. So, and these are quite dangerous, serious challenges that the civil society is dealing with. On the other hand, that's therefore inevitably people would like to be more under the radar, less publicized, less open about their activities, but also at the same time, as you rightly pointed out, unless you really work on the awareness and reach out and advocacy, you can't really connect to the people that you are representing, basically. I mean, you as in the civil society, not your organization specifically.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's a topic that really requires a lot of conversations and a lot of soul searching. I'm hoping that CHAIMA will bring some more light into this conversation. I have no doubt she will do that. Our third speaker is CHAIMA BOUHLEL, sorry, a research fellow at MENA program at Chatham House. A warm welcome to you, CHAIMA. It's a great pleasure to have you today. For civil society and citizens to be heard and to be able to contribute to good governance, and some of these dilemmas, some of these challenges were correctly highlighted by AMER. There needs to be always a necessary civic space, and this is the last point that we discussed, and this is the last point that was raised by AMER. How do you see this? The situations for the civic space, the ability of the citizens to take part in civil society activities and demand for change, and continue this dialogue of holding the government accountable, helping not to fail the trust of the people completely. The floor is yours, Chaima.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'd like to thank ISPI and the OECD for making this happen. First, there's something that I need to comment on as a Tunisian, as someone from the region. It pains me to frame certain developments in the region as positive developments, and I have to say that the normalization of relations with Israel is not something that is seen by most Arab citizens as a positive change. In fact, it is the best example for how reform is not inclusive and does not reflect necessarily civil society and citizens. And it's the perfect example of how, when there is absolutely no checks and balances with governments and any the necessary margin for democratic discussion, this is what happens. Decisions are made in the name of people without necessarily any form of engaging people or brokering and negotiating in a way that respects human rights and respects the history and the aggressions that could have happened. And this happens as we speak today, and there are aggressions on refugee camps. So I have to say this, and I have to remind anyone, myself first, and anyone who is speaking, that the question of reform is a problematic one, because it's usually a chicken or the egg question, right? Can we do reform that is inclusive and that is just, with the absence of democracy or human rights, or human rights? They should be synonymous, right? But it's a dangerous question, because with the absence of the pillars of democracy, should we not engage in reforms? That is also a dangerous conclusion to reach, because people do need to survive and need to protect their dignity. And we talk about water and climate change and brokering migration rules and economic developments and infrastructure and decentralization, and the show must go on. So to what extent do we are we giving our blessings to the situation by going with the show or resisting it? And this is an ongoing question. It's a more pressing question now in Tunisia, but I know it's a question that is across the region. So I have to say that democracy is the only logical framework for reform that is inclusive. But with the lack of democracy, this does not mean that we cannot engage with reform. In fact, it might be the only way for us to prove to citizens and the state that democracy is the only way. Because without inclusivity and without engaging, especially intermediary structures, and here I'm talking about civil society, but also political parties, and also international and national organizations, academia, the media, all of these are intermediary structures between citizens and those who are in charge, those who are making decisions. They're intermediary in their questioning, but also in the proposed answers, in reflecting the views. So the first thing I think that civil society is still able to do, but to lesser extents, is really putting those who are the communities that are directly affected, putting them in the forefront of the narrative. As we speak now in Tunisia, we have civil society organizations, local organizations that are amplifying the issue of water, for example. And setting it as a priority, even though the democratic situation in Tunisia is very different from what we used to experience at least 2 years ago, where we had a serious parliament that was directly elected by people with at least more participation, and we had a constitution that clearly stated that things should happen through a participatory manner. But this does not mean that people are not setting the agenda and are not trying to push to set their agenda on the table. Research and academia is still thriving as well, despite the democratic setback, let's say in Tunisia or in the region. We're not where we want to be. We're quite far, actually. But research and academia is focusing more on issues that maybe were not as attractive before. It still requires funding, but putting hands in hand between civil society and research and academia helps us gain more in resources and in time, and propose solutions that are more serious and more applicable. Being aware of the imbalance in power between those who are brokering reform, and here I'm talking about the state within states, but also about international actors. As we speak, we're talking also about migration, and we're talking about trying to negotiate deals between Europe and North Africa, and especially in Tunisia. We need to be aware that there's an imbalance in the dynamic, and that perhaps the absence of democracy can make those deals easier for states, they make them 1,000 times more difficult in reality for the citizens who are actually going to be dealing with the reality or the results of these agreements and these reforms. I mean, it's easy to call them a reform because they do change the reality, but at what cost? And the absence of civil society, the reason why I'm saying this is that the absence of civil society can make reforms at times easier because there's less resistance, but they might make the results more negative because civil society is able to highlight issues that are often either blindsided by governments because they have clear agendas and they have to deliver on promises, but in the long term and in the long run, those results can be extremely detrimental for the democracy, but also economy of all partners, not only one set of partners. We can maybe talk more later about what signs exist about the strengthening of civil society despite all of this, because I usually don't like to paint a bleak image. I think there's always a dynamic, and there is a dynamic, and if we draw the entire region, of course I come with an understanding and insight from Tunisia, but I also see this in Libya, and I see it in other countries where there are connections that are being made, there are narratives that are being shaped by civil society or non-organized citizens as well, because I think we also need to look at civil society in its diverse forms, in its structures, but also in its social movements, in its citizens who are trying to organize in more horizontal forms that are new, that are reflecting, more agility and a lean way of doing activism, really, and in proposing and in challenging, let's say, reforms or politics as they exist in our countries. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, really fascinating, to hear your perspective. Specifically, I was very much intrigued by your comment about, decisions or reform can be easier in the absence of civil society. But of course, lack of inclusion could, in the long run, could be leading to some more negative results. And yes, your comment about the question of lack of inclusion in, for example, some of the regional initiatives, should it be alienating certain nations or should it be befriending certain nations, is indeed quite alarming. But also at the same time, some might argue that any regional initiative that brings the region and the different nations together and to create an environment that is environment of dialogue rather than escalation and tension could in the long run indeed help the future of the region. But I mean that particular initiative is not the focus of today's conversation, and I appreciate your comment on it. But I just also felt obliged to say that there is an ongoing conversation and there is an ongoing dialogue on what could otherwise be the alternative, if not having an environment that maintains dialogue amongst different countries in the region. I'm going to go back to Miriam again, if I may. Thank you, all three panelists, for your great comments. We talked about reform from different perspectives, the role of civil society, what are the areas of reform, what are the challenges for civil society, what could or should change, or if you're label it as reform or change, again, that's a matter of interpretation. But we talked about all of these themes, and inclusive policies sit at the heart of governance and change. And I think we could all agree that unless inclusive policies are kept in place, that mechanisms are created to generate and encourage inclusive policies, this cannot be reached, whether in MENA region or beyond. A sizable portion of the population, of course, as I think all of you in one way or another touched upon this issue, are being very much isolated in various shapes and forms from any kind of participatory processes. In other words, the existing environment further marginalizes certain segments of the society. And this, of course, indeed creates the gap and widens the gap between what people expectations are and what government's capacity to deliver is. So in your opinion, Miriam, and in your experience, what can the governments in the MENA region do to develop and implement citizen-centered and inclusive policies and services that can address this issue of marginalization and create an environment of inclusion?
Thank you, Sarah. Before answering this question, I would also pick up on what CHAIMA was saying about having better policies if it's inclusive, and also to make the business case for that. We see a very strong correlation between participation and accountability on one hand side and public sector effectiveness on the other hand side. Hence, participation of civil society or of the public is not only part of the open government agenda, but is really a strategic necessity to modernize the public administration. I just wanted to make this point. On your question on having more inclusive policies addressed also to vulnerable groups, I would like to address this question in particular with regards to a particular segment of society, which is youth. And this is because the MENA region hosts one of the youngest population in the world. 60% of the people are below 30. The region is marked, on the other hand side, by the highest youth unemployment rate in the world. And nearly 40% of young people are living in fragile and conflict-affected areas in the region. I have also come across a recent survey, and young people, only 49% of young people think that their administrations have the right policies and tools at place to address their concerns. This is, of course, very worrying. And what we have done in the OECD is collect evidence, what we are usually doing, collecting good practices. I encourage you to read this report that was published last year, which is looking at youth at the center of government actions, and where we have benchmarked the experience of the region against the OECD recommendation on creating better opportunities for young people that was adopted by our member countries just last year. And here I would like to point to three main, let's say, priorities that can be looked at when being serious about inclusive policies. The first one, when it comes to youth, is to have an integrated youth policy in place. Youth has different needs at certain time. It's requirements on services, be it education, employment, health, transportation, housing, you name it. And for that, you need to have an integrated youth policy that is bringing these different portfolios together and have a mechanism in place that is also helping you to coordinate. What we have seen in the region is a push towards youth strategies. 7 countries in the region have such a youth strategy in place. However, implementation is a challenge in as much as there are weak administrative capacities or coordination mechanisms that really risk the implementation of such a strategy. There's definitely a room for greater support in the MENA countries, but also elsewhere in the world. This has much to do with the fact that the ministry that is in charge of youth policy is usually the Ministry of Youth and Sports, mainly youth working on sports in a lot of countries, and it's not necessarily the strongest ministry at the cabinet seat. The second part is participation and representation, thinking about what governments can do to support youth participation in public life, but also youth representation in public life. For instance, countries like Jordan or also Morocco have now youth quotas for parliamentary elections. Tunisia used to have it for the local election. CHAIMA, you can explain that. But then also thinking about consultation mechanisms that are there to support not only ad hoc initiatives involving young people in the service delivery, but really structured and long term, which should be devised. The third one is thinking about mainstreaming tools. I know mainstreaming is a horrible word. I always talk about representation rather. We know it from gender mainstreaming. There's also the youth mainstreaming that you can think of really, for instance, by having policies that support a youth length in the preparation, like youth impact assessments, or involving youth in intergenerational dialogues, or having also budget when you're preparing the budgets, that you are also budgeting according to social outcomes. And I think that's extremely promising, and also can help really to have a more systematic approach towards bringing the youth length in the policymaking. One final word on the legal framework, because that's something that we have observed in many countries as sometimes being also a barrier. When you are not able to run for candidate until you are 35, I know that Jordan recently reduced it from 30 to 25, which is promising, but still there are a lot of legal barriers that you do not think about now, but they are actually providing quite a lot of barriers in practice, and where governments can look at and also improve the legal environment for a better youth participation, representation, and better policies at the end. So I would like to stop here and give the floor back to Sarah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, very solid recommendations, and I really appreciate that. I usually encourage everybody at the end of the panel to make the solid recommendations, but I'm happy that you've already done that, and it's really highly appreciated. I want to come to the next two speakers with sort of an effort to bundle up the questions that are coming through a Q&A a function, and the question that I would also like to be addressed in the panel. I'll start with you, Chaima, if I may. We talked about decentralization processes, engaging governments engaging in various forms of what is called decentralization that can ultimately enhance citizen partnership, participation, not partnership. We also have a question that comes through the chat function, and it's touching upon the question of women, which we really haven't specifically dealt with in this panel, and I'm sure indirectly it was included in most of the comments and remarks. But how is the condition of women and gender inclusion, how could that be improved? What are the government's commitments in enhancing gender equality or equal access to the opportunities across society? So if you could bundle up both the question of decentralization and the question of gender, that would be highly appreciated. If not, just pick and choose for the next round. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'd like to add or build upon what Miriam was mentioning about proof that this works, that inclusion can actually make policies better. And I think decentralization is one of the best examples in Tunisia, both as a central reform, because it is a state level reform, but also the result of decentralization. I think what decentralization allows in contexts that are not, as democratic as we want, is that it allows to recreate the dream of inclusion and democracy on a smaller, more accessible, and more humane level, let's say, that has a lower political cost for the central state, but a high political gain for actors. And I have multiple data to share about the evidence of this. So basically, and I know it's the least attractive, let's say, approach to politics, because we often think that local politics is not the most important politics. But when you look at even the past 3 years, the most challenging moments for the central state were local moments. There were moments that were related to either handling the pandemic on a local level, or handling economic crises on a local level, handling waste, handling infrastructure at very localized places. Even immigration is in Tunisia is often a very local, it is a national level issue, but it's localized in its approach, and it's often the local elite and the local government that is at the forefront of dealing with these issues. So everything we had done in decentralization since 2014, it's easy to look back and say everything is gone with the wind, but it's not true. There are things that we can accumulate. And often when we look at government, it's not only the political representatives, it's also the administration. And that is something that remains. There's a lot of work that was done with the Tunisian administration, whether on a local level or on a national level, that, political systems come and go, and political systems can be determining for the success of any reform. But it's the administration that is really the one that is shaping access or shaping inclusion in a way, yes, with the existence of political will, but something remained in Tunisia. And it's and all of the work that was done, and including women or civil society, we still see a glimpse of that. Of course, it can easily go away if the political will goes against this, but on a local level, despite everything that happened, you still see that. There is almost a belief that if we don't do it together, we can't get there. If we don't do the planning together, then there will be resistance from people. If we don't do evaluation together, then people might not accept projects or might not understand why we did not invest. So it's a lesson that is really learned. This is not something that is just superficial. Inclusion of women. So I think the highlight of women inclusion was parity in elections that is horizontal and vertical, because we had lists. Now, in Tunisia now, the system of lists is gone, at least on a parliamentarian level, but also on a local level, and we're preparing ourselves for local elections. The silver lining is we will be testing the absence of parity and what that looks like. I can tell you that from our parliament elections, the number of women decreased in a terrifying way. So that is further evidence, if we need more evidence, that government should intervene and should push for more representation. Then Tunisia is the perfect example, because we went from ideal, or let's say best practice, to non-existence of any regulation or let's say policy that encourages women. And it's a good case to see of what works and what does not work, in case we need further evidence. Last thing, civil society, because we always talk about access for women for decision-making positions, but we're really talking about power. And civil society was a field that was extremely open to women, and it also was further evidence against this idea that women are not interested in power or politics. If we look at civil society and see the presence of women there, again, if we need more evidence, then it's proof that they are interested, they can do it, and they can take leadership positions and be involved in reform. If they can do it in civil society, why not in state and government?
Thank you very much. We are quickly running out of time, AMER. I'm just going to come to you for the last words. We have two questions. One of them is not directly addressed to you, but I'm going to bundle these two questions together. You can decide if you want to go for both of them very briefly, touch upon both, or just pick and choose. One is the question of trust. How could we improve the situation of lack of trust? And Miriam, if you had the 2 cents you wanted to add to the final comment, please feel free to raise hand and comment on that, because this question of trust was specifically addressed to you. And the second question is the question of Ukraine-Russian conflict that has severely affected the state-citizen relations in the MENA region. It is believed that the citizen-state relations in the long term can very much be damaged by the current policies of limiting the civic space. So what's your take on that? How could we return lack of an absence of trust, and how do you see the current conflict in Ukraine affecting the situation in MENA? I think you're still mute, Amer. You're still mute.
Yeah, about a quick note about women and women participation. Just to give you an idea that one of the things that we are doing, we are monitoring hate speech on social media, and we have this observatoire in monitoring the hate speech on social media for the last 2 years. One of the most important results that we reach is the relation between hate speech and social media against women, especially how much it decreased the level of women participation in public life and in the political life. Last local election in Jordan, we have the number of women who run to be a candidate decreased because of the attack they are facing on social media. So this is a very critical thing we should all care about, because it's becoming one of the serious challenges against women participation, especially in the MENA region. Going to the trust, trust is one of the challenges. It's not only the trust in Jordan, at least not only trust between citizen and the government, citizen and the parliament. These are very low. Also between citizen and civil society, which is another problem, and it's a bigger challenge. So when you ask about this, it's about related to accountability. It's related about transparency. It's about techniques. It's about conspiracy theory. It's for this reason, I said at the beginning, we should be professional. We should be accountable before asking the government to be accountable. We should be visible. We should have this public reach to citizens, so we have the trust and confidence. Last point, and the quick point about the Ukraine-Russian, the impact here in the MENA region, from my point of view, it's about the priorities for the international community. We feel as civil society that some priorities are changed, and we are now feeling a little bit more alone in the MENA region, and the priorities is going to another place when it comes to civil society support politically and financially. Sorry, I don't want to take the MERIAM time.
Yeah, thank you. Maya, would you like to have the final word before we end?
On trust, because it was also a question that came up. I think it's important really to look at the drivers of trust, and what the OECD has done in the past years with the trust survey that was published last year, and the next edition is due next year, is to look precisely on what triggers the level of trust. And here there are 5 main drivers that the OECD has observed. The first one is responsiveness. So are the services really delivering on the demands of the countries, of the citizens, sorry. Reliability, are they also delivered consistently, and our government anticipating the challenges ahead? Openness is one of the biggest drivers for trust, and here we are not only talking about communication or access to information, we are really also talking about being serious about stakeholder engagement. Integrity is one of the drivers, the 4th drivers of trust. Having a public sector workforce that values and standards of code of conduct, but also fighting corruption. And then the last trigger or driver for trust is fairness, leaving no one behind. We have just launched the Government at a Glance survey on Friday. I invite you to have a look at it, where you can see a lot of the data also related to trust with regards to the OECD member countries. And before I will not be given the floor again, I was thinking of one recommendation that I could have, and I think my recommendation would be that ideas do not flow freely, neither in the Middle East nor elsewhere in the world, and therefore engaging in a policy dialogue, exchanging good practices and agreeing on common standard on what works and what doesn't would be my recommendation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Unfortunately, we're short of time. CHAIMA, would you like to have the last 30-second bullet point to make one recommendation, perhaps, before we say goodbye? And on that happy note, we're going to end the panel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Just to add one thing is that issues that perhaps sometimes when we box issues in one country, we often do not allow it space to freely take the room that it's supposed to take. There are issues that are cross-regional, and I think promoting this kind of collaboration in thinking about them. I know the OECD is doing a lot about that, especially in relation to youth, for example, but working more on that can maybe liberate those discussions from the reality, from nation-based realities. Going bigger might help us liberate our thought about it and find ways around it that can help us see it in more innovative and why not more effective ways. So regional collaboration in the thinking and in the reform is an important thing that I would like to stress.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you for being here. And I hope to see you again on other occasions. Thank you.